talk about this cancel culture today. We disagreed, but we at least respected in the democratic arena. He's entitled to his opinion, I'm entitled to mine, and we'll argue and debate about it in public, and may the best person win. Today, if you hold a different public opinion from someone else, often the tendency is to shut up the other person, say that cannot even be talked about. And I think that's one of the most dangerous trends in the democratic arena right now, this cancel culture that does not permit the discussion and debate of contrary views.
I think so much of our political effort is spent on how do we elect the people we want to public office. And I don't know, and you would have watched this over the years, how good is the integration between those who are making political decisions and all of the other elements, all of the issue-based groups, the advocacy groups, the media that go into building a consensus around an issue? Are we doing all right?
I have two ways of coming at this, and we touched on one before. Well, one is to distinguish between the movements behind political parties and the parties themselves. And I use this pyramid. You can say, yes, there's a political party, and if you want to get laws passed by a majority in an assembly, you got to get people elected there. I'm not diminishing that in any way, shape. I've spent a fair amount of my life in that arena, but there's all these other components if you want to get that done. The think tanks that generate intellectual capital, the advocacy groups that go and help get more public support for it, the communicators, the fundraisers, the trainers, there's all the rest of that. And I think that's the area that has to be strengthened in order for the political parties, and in my case, the Conservative Party, to be more effective. And then in order for that to happen, I have a big emphasis on the need for more networking among those different components of the movement. That if they're not talking to each other, if they don't know each other, if they don't know who the players are, that they'll be less effective. And one of the difficulties for Conservatives is partly because we're entrepreneurial and independent, we tend to operate in silos. These different components of the movement are in silos. They're not well connected. So I use a second diagram. I like matrices. If you take all the components of the movement, list them this way, and then if you list them this way, that matrix will define all the possible first-order connections between every component of the movement. Yes, there's the party, but is it connected to the think tank, to the advocacy group, and I encourage people. We used to put on these networking conferences. In fact, we're still doing that through an organization called Canada Strong and Free, to identify where are you in this matrix. Are you a think tank person? Are you a provincial political party person? Are you an advocacy person? Are you a trainer? Find yourself in this matrix and then say, do I have a connection with the person in the next box and the next box and the next box? And if you don't, why not get that connection? You'll be stronger. The movement will be stronger if we're interconnected than if we're all operating in silos. So that's kind of my theory on how to strengthen the movement.
And you're so right. You've persuaded me. And when you're talking about Alberta or Western Canada or Conservatives in general, I can agree that integration and networking makes sense. But then you bring in the factor of Quebec. And it almost feels like as soon as we hit the border of Quebec, Conservative messaging just hits a brick wall. And we've seen it with the polling results there. Is there any common cause? Is there a way to bring Quebec into this network?
This gets into another subject of sort of coalition building. And I'm big on coalition building. In a way, our whole experience, the Reform Party was a coalition. Like the people that originally were, some of them were been Liberals, a lot of them had been Conservatives, a lot of them people have been opted out. So we got them to work together. And then in order to broaden it out, we tried to create this Canadian alliance. It was a coalition between the federal reformers and the Klein Conservatives in Alberta, the Filmon Conservatives in Manitoba, and the Harris Conservatives in Ontario. We got this bigger thing. But the object, though, is to get a majority in the House of Commons. So then Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay took it one more round. This is coalition building, put in the alliance together with what was left of the old PC party, and eventually got a minority government, and then you finally got a majority government. This was built on coalition building, so there's it's a very important function, and political participants should learn how to build coalitions, particularly today when you've got people in all these warring camps. Now, coming back to Quebec, I have a graph in the book that some of my Quebec friends don't like because it shows Quebec's influence declining in the 21st century. I show a graph of Quebec population in relation to the total population going down, French speakers in relation to English speakers going down, Quebec contribution to the GDP in relation to the total GDP going down. And so I say, some of my Quebec friends will say, well, you're probably cheering this and you're happy about this. They say, no, I'm not. Because what this is going to do is either going to generate another separatist movement in Quebec and blow the country apart. And it's not good. But what you're going to have to decide is you're going to need allies eventually. You can't rely on just your own strength to get your way as you have in the past with the federal government. You're going to need allies somewhere in the rest of the country, unless you're a separatist. And one place you could find them in Western Canada, because what we want is a more decentralized federation, and you want a more decentralized federation. You want it more for social, cultural, linguistic reasons. We want it for economic reasons, but the common ground is a more decentralized federation. So is that an area where the West and Quebec can work together, where Western conservatives and Quebec conservatives can work together? And on the more practical level, I'm not a big advocate of constitutional change because it's so difficult to get. But if I could get one constitutional amendment, and this would resonate in Quebec and would resonate in the West, it would be a prohibition on federal involvement in areas of provincial jurisdiction, such as natural resources, or joint jurisdiction, such as health and environment, without the consent of the province that's affected. Virtually every province, particularly Quebec and particularly the Western provinces, ought to be in favor of that constitutional amendment. So are there not some things we can work on together where we have a shared interest?
What about one step further, not signing on to any international accords without getting provincial buy-in?
The way I elaborate it is that the federal government should be prohibited from spending, taxing, regulating, and treaty making in areas of provincial jurisdiction or joint jurisdiction without the consent of the... So if a province wants to go along with the federal government signing the Paris Accord, it can agree to that, but some other province that doesn't want to can object to it and prohibit it.
Do you think we're at a point where there's enough goodwill between the West, maybe Alberta in particular, and Quebec to work together on that project? Or are Alberta and Saskatchewan feeling so disenfranchised and disconnected from the priorities of the rest of the country, particularly on resource development and
Well, of course, it
environment?
depends. If people take the separatist option, and there will be growing sentiment for separatism in Quebec eventually, as Quebec's influence in the federal system declines, and there's this interest in the West. I'm more talking about here's what federalists that are discontent with the current federation, don't like the way it's working, either in Quebec or in the West, but want to change the way the federation works as distinct from... there is a story on the separatist sentiment. There used to be a lawyer in Edmonton who had a funny speech on separation. He claimed that the country was riddled with separatism. That actually Vancouver Island would like to separate from BC. BC has already separated, but they just didn't tell anybody. Northern Alberta would like to separate from Southern Alberta. The West would like to separate from the rest. Quebec wants to separate. Labrador wants to separate from Newfoundland. The rest of the country wants to separate from Toronto. And his punchline at the end of all of this was all these separatists could get together, they could unite this country. But the alternative to that is if there's that much alienation, and this was it, he wasn't all being funny. If there's that much alienation, if you could come up with some changes in the Constitution, changes in how federalism works, that there is less of that alienation, that this would be what would hold the country together. And I do think the biggest single source of tension between the central government and the provinces is when the federal government intervenes in areas of provincial or joint jurisdiction. If you could eliminate that, you would eliminate at least 50% of the national unity problems in the country.
Okay, so you say that you don't hold out much hope for constitutional change, and I understand why you would say that, but we are having this discussion of whether it's Quebec getting to a point where they don't have the influence and deciding perhaps to hold another secession referendum, or Alberta and Saskatchewan feeling the same way. So you pose this question of what does our future look like? Is secession in our future, or is reconfederation in the future? Is reconfederation possible? Is there a way for us to say, okay, we came together as a country on the basis of certain principles. Things have changed a lot. in the last 150 years? Now we need to reassess and reset the rules of how we work together?
Well, I think it's possible, but it would require somebody to champion it. It would somebody to champion it, like Sir John A. Macdonald and Brown championed the first get together. And but I think I believe the West is growing stronger and stronger each decade. I think there's a shift to the Asia Pacific shift of population, of economic activity, means that the West is going to get bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. And the question is, some people are so angry at the current alienation that they say, well, the West ought to separate. What they're usually talking about is Alberta and maybe part of Saskatchewan, maybe 8 to 10% of the land mass of the country. If the West acted as one big unit, what old F.W.G. Haltain called, if you act as big Westerners, if you took all 96 federal ridings west of and north of the Manitoba-Ontario border, now you're talking about almost 50% of the land mass of the country. If those people united to say there has to be a change in the Federation, I don't know how the rest of Canada could resist that. This isn't just one province. This isn't even just two provinces. This is half the country saying it has to change. Now, if there was a champion for that position, I call it reconfederation. I think that would be preferable to breaking up the country, but it needs a champion. And right now, it's not clear where that champion's going to come from.
So the West is getting stronger, but I think there's this perception that our aspirations are getting stymied. And so
yes, yeah.
Where's the balance in that? How do you find a resolution? I mean, we've talked a lot about how conservatives can play that role in finding the middle way, and that with the principles of being able to reconcile, that we might be able to lead the effort. But how does that begin?
Well, I think one, and this is with Canadians, if you want Canadians to go from A to C, you got to show them B. Some step in that direction, but not the full way, because we don't like taking big leaps. And I do think this recognizing that we need a more decentralized federation might be that first step. What province should disagree with prohibiting the federal government from interfering in provincial jurisdictions or joint jurisdictions without the consent of that province? What province in Eastern Canada or anywhere would disagree with that? Isn't that a first step towards a more decentralized federation, which is the first step to a reconfederation?
Now, if the conservative movement could just stay together, and yes. You know, you and I both have had our share in having yep. our parties go off and break away from the mainstream conservative group. And I'd like a little more of the history on that one, because it does strike me we're at another dangerous point where, whether it's the federal party breaking apart because it now has a central Canadian leader that may not be as sensitive to the Western Canadian issues, or if it's even in a Western province like Alberta, where a former federal leader may not be seen to be as aggressive in fighting for some of the ideas that are being proposed for the Alberta agenda. So there does seem to me that the coalition is not that solid right now at either the federal or provincial level.
I'm a great believer in coalition building, but like you're saying, that's a real challenge. So you even get parties that were apart together. How do you keep them together? I think part of the key is to make sure the union was on principled grounds, not on pragmatic grounds. We're just getting together so that we can get elected, so that you can appeal on the basis of principle as to why we should stick together. I think, again, persuading the public that they're better supporting this coalition and this thing hanging together than they are supporting it going apart. These are all preconditions to making coalition building work. We were talking earlier about my first exercise in trying to put two parties together, and not many people know about this, was back when my father was still Premier of Alberta. Social Credit was the governing party, but it had been in power for over 30 years. It was aging, and some of us younger people thought this thing's got to be reinvigorated or it's going to go down the tube. And Peter Lougheed was just starting out with revamping the provincial Progressive Conservative Party, which had become moribund. A few of us decided, why don't we put these two together? And we got the grudging permission from the elders in both parties to let us get a little task force together to put this together. So on the social credit side was myself and a Dr. Eric Schmidt, who was a consultant to the cabinet, and Joe Clark and Merv Leach, who represented Peter Lougheed with the embryonic Progressive Conservative Party. And we met to see, can we put these two parties together? And we developed this document. And we actually ended up agreeing, but there's a lesson in this, probably agreeing for the wrong reason. Schmidt and I were particularly concerned about the principles on which this would be based and the policies it adopted, because the thing would have ended up running the government of Alberta if it came about. Joe and Merv, because they were in the process of building a new party, were more interested in what the thing would be named and what the logo would be and what the communications would be and how you would explain the rollout and that. So when we got these discussions, Schmidt and I would raise all these principles and policies, and Joe and Merv would say, sure. And they would raise all this communication stuff, and we'd say, sure. But we were agreeing because we didn't think what they were talking about was important, and they didn't think what we were talking about was important. Anyway, we put this whole document together. They were going to call it the Social Conservative Party. It didn't mean what social conservative, but social from social credit, conservative was not rocket science. Anyway, we put this all together in a book and presented it to the powers that be, who totally rejected it. My father let this go along, but the cabinet were absolutely adamant that we don't need any new blood. We're fine. And the Lougheed Conservatives were getting close enough to seeing some success. We're going to be the government anyway in 3 or 4 years, so we don't need this either. So not only did they completely reject it, they also ordered us to destroy the documentation on this, because we don't want this being talked about anywhere. So how to destroy the stuff? Joe was living in an apartment downtown, not far from the legislation. It was kind of awkward to be incinerating stuff because people could see it. But our family had this family farm outside the city with a ranch house with a big fireplace in it. So Joe and I packed all this stuff out there and carefully fed all this documentation into the fire and burnt it all. So that's where my first attempt at putting parties together. And the other funny afterthought about it was years later, when Joe won the federal election and became the Prime Minister of Canada, my mother, who witnessed all of this years before, was sitting there watching the television. She says, "Isn't that Joe Clark guy, the young guy that was sitting in here throwing paper into my fireplace?" I said, "Yes, Mother, he's come a long way from those days." But they actually learned quite a bit from that. That was not a successful putting together of two parties, but I learned quite a bit of that, which helped us later on when we were trying to do this for real in the federal arena.
I was really hoping that you were going to end that story by saying that you kept a copy somewhere.
There is one copy. There is one copy. Schmidt couldn't destroy his because he was technically working for the executive council, and this was public property. So despite the order to destroy it, not all copies were destroyed.
Okay, you have to tell one more story about Joe Clark, because I love that one. Because I would have thought, because of the history that you had together, that there might have been another opportunity for the two parties to come together when you met again at the federal level, but it didn't turn out that way.
Well, we tried just when we formed that Canadian alliance, and then the next step was to try to unite it with the federal Conservatives. Joe by then had become once again leader of the what was left of the old Progressive Conservative Party, and I appealed to Joe and said, "Why don't we put this thing together?" I was scheduled to give a big speech on all of this, and I said, "You can give the big speech if you'll say we're going to put it together. I don't care who gives the speech." But and Joe didn't categorically say no, but he didn't say yes either, and so it passed, and eventually it was put together by Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay. But just on the fact that Joe and I knew Joe and he knew me from university. We had different views. Joe was committed to, he wouldn't say the Progressive Conservative Party was perfect, but it was the vehicle that he wanted to work through and would make his contribution through in the federal arena. I was aware of this Western tradition of creating new parties and those having some influence on the other parties. And I very early on said, I'm going to wait 20 years for the next one of these to come along. I'm going to go that way. But we didn't censure each other. Joe didn't say, well, you can't talk about that. You say a word about that. You ought to be canceled and shut up about that new party business. And I would never say to Joe, what you're doing is completely illegitimate. It's a worthless, useless cause. You shouldn't even be allowed to talk about this cancel culture today. We disagreed, but we at least respected in the democratic arena. He's entitled to his opinion, and I'm entitled to mine, and we'll argue and debate about it in public, and may the best person win. Today, if you hold a different public opinion from someone else, often the tendency is to shut up the other person, say that cannot even be talked about. And I think that's one of the most dangerous trends in the democratic arena right now, this cancel culture that does not permit the discussion and debate of contrary views.
Yeah, it's going to get worse, I'm sure,
Yeah.
before it gets better. Can you talk a little more, though, about the stability of conservatism? Because I think we have this sense that the conservative family should stay together, but they don't seem to have the same views on the progressive side. There's a multitude of progressive parties. There's the Liberals who are very progressive, the Greens, the New Democrats, the Bloc Québécois is kind of a progressive party. So why is it okay for them to split in multiple different pieces? But we, on the conservative side of the spectrum, we tend to have a split and then a reunification. It almost seems like it's a pattern.
Well, I think part of the problem is because the progressive side and the conservative side progressive seems to me just imitate what the other guys are doing on how to manage the welfare state, on the environment, on climate change. Just you can't beat them, so kind of if that's what progressivism means, then that's going to be in conflict with core conservative values. If you could persuade conservatives, look, there's an alternative approach you can take on the environment that's not the same as theirs and is consistent with. We'll address the environmental issue. We're not saying ignore that. We're saying yes, address it, but address it from this perspective. Yes, there's a need to deal with poverty, but you don't have to embrace the approach the other guys are taking. There's an alternative approach to that that's more consistent with conservative principles. I think if you could to take the progressives who's genuinely concerned about these other issues and whose default position is, well, I'll just adopt the other guy's position, to say there is a conservative alternative that can be developed. That's where you might get more cohesion within the conservative movement.
All right, we're going to talk about the last segment, strengthening democracy.